As Europe was leaving behind a period of war, bloodshed, and religious turmoil, thinkers were pondering if there might be another way, a way for Protestant and Catholic people all across Europe to share the continent, to be able to find resolutions, seeking out answers by means other than appeal to clergy and dogma. In this age of burgeoning science, an idea grew that perhaps they could live in a new system based on human observation, a system of contemplated reason rather than religious dogma. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes would publish Leviathan. Though Hobbes remained a monarchist, and generally an absolute monarchist, the idea he would put forth would be the basis of the social contract. He would identify government as an artificial man, a concept which people built to escape the state of nature. There was a questioning of authority as it had been for centuries. If the unshakable monopoly on truth held by the Catholic Church was in question, then so too was the system of crown and title. Though the English Civil War would see the supremacy of Parliament emerge, at least for a period, there was no real call to end monarchy. Yet the conceptualization of a monarch began to change. Under the new social contractionist view, these structures of government and monarchy, and particularly the post-Westphalian nation-state concept, were perhaps not inherent to God's order, but were instead constructs of man, one which existed to allow for human cooperation, one which people inherently assented to, entering into a contract with each other, to exist in a system of structure and hierarchy in order to escape the naturally brutal existence that would befall man in the wild. The 17th century would see a burst of ideas. As the period of warfare was coming to an end, thinkers in these wealthy nations were doing a great deal of exploration. In 1687, Isaac Newton would publish Principia Mathematica. Isaac Newton is a fascinating figure, though he's popularly remembered today for his work in understanding gravity and advancing mathematics. He as well was an astronomer, an inventor, warden of the Royal Mint, an alchemist, and even an investor on the side, himself becoming caught in the South Sea bubble. Though on the surface, he may appear to have a sort of modern, hyper-rational mathematical mind, he was far more philosophical. While studying at Cambridge as a young man, he would take heavy inspiration from the novel scientists, like Galileo, and he would as well begin to study philosophy, particularly taking inspiration from René Descartes, who, in addition to being foundational in modern epistemology, developed a philosophical worldview that relied heavily on mathematics. Mathematics would fascinate Newton, developing a study which would result in the foundations of calculus. Yet he was also quite drawn to Hermetic thought, becoming deeply engrossed in alchemy. The reintroduction of Hermetic ideas had been occurring in England for some time, notably becoming quite prominent in the court of Elizabeth I. And this new wave of alchemical study would influence Newton with the idea that laws of nature could not only be rationally understood, but could be manipulated on a physical and spiritual level. The publication of Principia would put forward the idea that the universe follows predictable mathematical laws, and as years went on, and thought like this began to percolate into society, so too would a new question be asked. If the universe follows these such laws, then would that not mean that social and political systems do too? The world of the late 17th century was a massive turning point for Britain. In 1685, King James VII and II would ascend to the throne following his brother, the restored King Charles II. At this point, the religious divides that had begun during the Reformation were still presenting serious problems across Britain. The nation had gone through many changes as Catholic and Protestant were in conflict. Yet by this point during James's reign, it had become quite clear. England was a Protestant nation. There had been some question as to whether King Charles II had Catholic sympathies, with some even claiming that he converted to Catholicism just before his death. Yet James presented a much more troubling situation, as not only was he overtly Catholic, but he began to appoint many Catholics to among the most prominent positions in the kingdom. Many began to become increasingly uneasy, and in 1687, things would snap. That year, the Declaration of Indulgence would be declared, and legal restrictions against Catholics would be dropped, demonstrating Catholicism to now be truly accepted within James's kingdom. To many, particularly the Protestant nobles, this was entirely unacceptable. Sentiment became much more intense, and to many, it appeared as though James was ushering in papal tyranny. The following year, James would imprison 7 bishops who refused to read his declaration. He was making a crackdown against those who wouldn't accept Catholic acceptance. Yet, in the Protestant English courts, the bishops were found to be not guilty. That same year, he would have a son, and it now became clear to England that the kingdom was to be under a Catholic dynasty. In 1688, a group of Protestant peers would invite the Dutch stadtholder, functionally monarch, William of Orange, to come to Britain, asking that he invade Britain to protect Protestantism. James would prepare a defense, and it looked as though the kingdom was going into another civil war. Yet as William's army advanced, waves of prominent defections would occur, and it became clear to James that this was a battle he could not win. James would flee to France, and his daughter and her husband, Queen Mary II and King William III, would be crowned the new monarchs. Back on the continent, James would prepare to return to take back the throne. Yet in Britain, an entirely new government was being formed. While the idea of parliamentary sovereignty had been introduced during the English Civil War, it was now being codified into law. Absolute monarchy had now officially ended, being replaced with a constitutional monarchy. Upon being offered the crown, William and Mary were presented with a list of grievances, requiring them to formally agree to limitations on the monarch's power. This would ultimately be codified into law in 1689 as the English Bill of Rights, banning the monarchy from suspending laws without Parliament, protecting freedom of speech within Parliament, barring Catholics from the throne, and placing new limitations on what the King and Queen could do. It had now become official. Absolute divine right had ended, and notions of the rights of Englishmen that had long existed since the days of Alfred the Great had now been codified into a new legal document, a new sort of social contract. That year, in 1689, John Locke would publish 2 treatises on government. This work would focus heavily on the idea of rights, introducing a phrase that would become foundational to English social philosophy: the idea that all men have a right to life, liberty, and property. He would build on the social contractionist ideas that were being introduced, putting forward the idea that people have a right to revolution if the just relationship between people and government has been broken. He would as well publish a letter concerning toleration that year. In this work, he would formulate the idea of the separation of church and state, positing that religious belief is a private matter. There's a lot that needs to be disentangled here. One thing that's very important to note is that this was put forward during an era of divides within Catholics and Protestants. This has become a major point of contention in today's world, as you run into the problem of what do you do when different peoples of diametrically opposed religious belief attempt to exist within one system. So much of the liberal worldview that was being formulated at this time had a sort of assumption of Christian morality as a sort of neutral state. Christian precepts were taken as givens, and thus other notions like transubstantiation and consubstantiation could be relegated as matters of private concern. This formulation has been a really tricky point in today's world, as that assumption of Christian as neutral has really broken down. Because what really is a religion? A religion is a system that contains the most fundamental axioms that a person has. You can't simply privately have all your axioms and fundamental beliefs, and in public have none of your axioms and fundamental beliefs, as those axioms and fundamental beliefs instruct everything that you do. So at some level, a civilization is going to have a religion embedded in it. Say someone holds a religious belief that they must forcibly convert everyone, while another has a belief that they must never listen to those of other religions. and perhaps a third which recognizes no law above religious law. They all can't be wedged into this Christian as neutral liberal world, as that would be akin to saying your entire worldview, all of your beliefs, your axioms, your moral system, you must put all of that aside and live within our framework, as our framework is neutral. Well, you can't have that neutrality. The moral philosophical substrate, the fundamental architecture of how one understands reality itself, was understood to have that biblical core, and this has become a main point of division in today's world. So it is worthwhile to consider that when these ideas were being put forward, there were very different assumptions about the moral philosophical worldview of those involved. Perhaps one can keep differences of Catholic and Protestant private, but every law, every social interaction, the very notions of what truth itself is, all of those are built on religious presuppositions, and no civilization can be truly religion neutral. We will see as we go forward the assumption of a biblical worldview as the moral philosophical neutral is going to be a point that repeatedly causes troubles. As the 18th century began, the expansion of ideas accelerated rapidly, with increasingly more and more radical ideas breaking out amongst the upper classes and intelligentsia. Perhaps the most foundational thinker to this period was Voltaire. At this point, French and English civilization were becoming quite different. England had become a Protestant, proto-liberal, constitutional monarchy, and it was gearing its civilization towards science and industry. However, France had become much more culturally focused. Its absolute monarchy continued to retain its position, with a quite subjugated nobility. Yet, the French monarchy was becoming increasingly isolated, the nobility increasingly aloof, and conditions on many of their estates lagging behind those in England. At the French king's court in Versailles, French civilization had become focused on culture. There was an explosion of art, music, fashion, literature, theater. France was holding itself up as the cultural pillar of Europe, with the primary fights in taste and culture being between France and Italy. For example, the battle between French and Italian opera, Le Chorale des Bouffons, the French Baroque style and the Italian Baroque style. These were the two polar points of high culture across Europe. The Germans were attempting to catch up, the much more austere Dutch refusing to engage in anything so Catholic, and the still Puritan-influenced English losing out on cultural relevance. Within Versailles, there were even grants to be a chef, being paid as though a research scientist to attempt to discover new recipes. Beginning in the 17th century, the sheer explosion of culture that came out of Versailles was staggering. So much of modern film and comedy can be traced back to the writer Molière. Much of modern music can be traced back to the ideas of Jean-Baptiste Lully, and modern music theory, Jean-Philippe Rameau. Yet as all this cultural elegance and sophistication was unfolding, becoming the home of a sort of extreme form of Baroque, when the 18th century arrived, many of its thinkers were much more radical. They hadn't had a Bill of Rights like the English. There wasn't a sort of mediated middle ground, and so for their intellectual counterparts, they were writing in opposition to the Catholic Church, an absolute monarchy, and worse conditions amongst the peasantry. Voltaire would write Letters on the English. This would become one of the most foundational works in anti-monarchic sentiment in France. It would offer a very harsh critique of the absolute power of the king and of the Catholic Church in France. In 1748, Montesquieu would publish The Spirit of the Laws. He would propose a separation of powers, a social system whereby power acts as a check to power. One model he put forth would be highly inspirational to the later American revolutionaries, a proposal that government be broken up into a legislative, judicial, and executive part. The attacks against the old system were far more radical in France, and this is a pattern that will most certainly continue. There was no novel Protestant Church of France. There was no constitutional French monarchy. There was no French Bill of Rights. There was the king, the church, and the increasingly detached nobility. Another fascinating development that would occur as well from a Frenchman was Denis Diderot's enormous contributions to Encyclopedia, the original Encyclopedia. Today we take things like encyclopedias and dictionaries for granted, being rather quaint older notions at this point, in the era of not only Wikipedia and similar sites, but large language models. But it's actually something pretty funny to think about if you take a step back. Imagine a world without dictionaries and without encyclopedias, where nobody had put forward the concept. Then one day you're talking to your friend. He tells you, "Hey, I think I'm gonna make a book." So you ask what it is. "Oh, it's gonna be a book of facts." "Oh, what facts?" "Oh, well, all of the facts, alphabetically." What a comically aspy idea. Now take that for a moment and imagine the dictionary. "Hey, what are you working on?" "Oh, it's a book of words." "Yeah, well, that's what's in books." No, it's all of them. I'm making a list of all the words I know." "Oh, yeah, well, I figure if we have the list of all the facts, where we explain what everything is, well, maybe there should be a list of what all the words mean." Well, this is a funny aside. It does put you into the headspace that people were in at this time. People were becoming convinced that this very rational, scientific manner was the way to understand the universe. It's a very linear, logical, observational, Spock sort of approach. And at the same time, there was a degree of spiritual belief that was being dispensed with. Though most everyone in Europe would still think of themselves as Catholic or Protestant, there was a rising sort of apatheism, and even an increase in atheism. A materialist worldview was beginning to form. In 1762, the social contractionist idea would be quite firmly solidified with the publication of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract. He would put forward the idea of the general will, that government and laws should exist as a collective decision of the people. This is a really tricky, arcane concept, the idea of the will of the people. This is an idea incredibly foundational to the modern liberal right-to-rule story. I am the ruler because it is the will of the people. But just step back for a moment. What does that possibly mean? Is this like the average of what everyone wants? What happens if the averagest thing of what everyone wants is something that nobody wants? Is this just sort of vaguely aggregated? Is this the least objectionable thing that everyone wants? Is this what people as a group want? Or some sort of way to get what every person individually wants? This has never really been tackled very well. Rousseau would write that the general will always inclines to collective interests, and not private selfish interests. He would put forward that the general will was not an aggregation of each individual's will, but instead the will which was common to all people within a society. And this is something that liberal philosophy has tried to get more precise for a very long time. They can't do it, but they have tried. And something that's really wiggly about it is that there is a sort of sense that people have that there is a collective will. People know when the rulers of a society are acting against what the people would want. People know when a government is not acting on behalf of the people. So there certainly is some reality underlying that concept, but there's just no good way to define it. And here's another problem. What if a ruler is doing something that is in the interest of the people? However, the people at large do not know that the action of the ruler is being done for that purpose. The people, in general, believe that their rulers should do something different. They are opposed to what the ruler is doing. However, if the ruler were to do what the people wanted, then that would actually be detrimental to their interest. So you do have to differentiate between what people want and a people's interest. So is the will of a people what they would want if they had perfect knowledge and knew what was in their best interest? Well, much of liberal thought has arrived at yes. It is what people would want if they knew what was in their interest. See if you can spot any way that that's a problem. It's resulted in the stupid little people don't know what's best for them. I know what's best for them. And you've just looped right back around to "I'm enlightened and know what's best. The people should just shut the hell up." Trying to make this idea concrete has caused a mess of problems. It's one of the most troubling ideas that has arisen in liberalism. And what's so troubling is that people do know when a people's interest is being represented. People do know when it's being violated. So it's not possible to entirely dispense with this nexus of notions. Yet at the same time, whenever someone tries to make it concrete, it becomes immediately abused. As is evident from that example, this wave of thinkers would begin a new era in Enlightenment thought, radical liberalism. Here, not only was there increased talk of placing constitutional constraints on monarchies, but republican ideas were beginning to pop up. There were now, in France, groups of intellectuals meeting to genuinely discuss how to end the monarchy. The days of abstraction and theory were ending, and radical action emerging. In 1762, Rousseau would publish a treatise on education. He would put forward the idea that children should be taught to think for themselves, and that they should not be made to simply memorize facts or dogmas. Prior to this point, all of this liberal Enlightenment thought was quite relegated to the upper classes, with the bulk of its thinkers amongst the bourgeois middle intelligentsia. And though these novel ideas on pedagogy were still broadly being aimed at the bourgeois middle class, some talk would even begin to emerge about educating the peasantry in this manner. Social class structures were undergoing a substantial change as well. For centuries, there had been very wealthy merchant and financial families, yet the monarchies and traditional nobilities remained firmly in place. Yet now, well into the 18th century, as empires were spreading across the world, commercial and banking families were rising, and many who previously would have been part of the bourgeois middle class were rising to positions of true dominance. Old noble families were falling or losing their wealth. These new money families were in many cases marrying in, and in some cases they were being granted new titles. A new ruling class was rising. Things were changing substantially by the time of the mid-18th century. The ideas of individualism that had been growing since the days of the Renaissance had now become an entirely novel worldview. A belief that everyone was part of a social contract, that everyone had inherent rights, and that everyone could think rationally and scientifically to mediate reality and society together. It was becoming increasingly obvious to the centuries-old institutions that there can be some real problems emerging. In 1776, Adam Smith would publish The Wealth of Nations. Here he would argue for a system of free trade based upon self-interest, arguing that rational, self-interested actors, free to engage without hindrance in a free and open market, would yield the greatest prosperity. His ideas were placing enormous trust in individuals and individual agency, as well as individual rationality. And this was in stark contrast to many of the older economic models that were in place at the time. Models which relied heavily on imperial monopolies, granted by royal charter. Monopolies which existed with the goal of accumulating as much gold and silver possible for their respective kingdoms. Wealth of Nations was an entirely different model. Now these new liberal ideas had reached into just about every aspect of one's life. Now, the source of truth had gone from scripture and tradition, and had become based on reason and science. The social structures of Europe had gone from feudal hierarchy to notions of legal equality and citizenship. The role of the state had gone from protecting structure, land, title, crown, and church, and had become based around protecting individual rights. And now, in economics, the idea was being put forward that the old model of imperial monopoly should be dispensed with and replaced with free trade capitalism. The 17th and 18th centuries would see many solutions to the problems of old that would prove to be remarkably successful. There were incredible innovations, incredible discoveries, and these thinkers truly had sharp minds. Yet at the same time, we have now had centuries to see their results, and to think over the ideas that were novel to them. And there were many problems within their thinking, for they may have dispensed too much with the spiritual and traditional, becoming too reliant on the rational and scientific. Many of their ideas had no way of bounding themselves. Many were rather optimistic and perhaps naive. Think of the general will and the social contract. Think of the idea of the blank slate man, and the assertion that society can be religiously neutral with all within it. If one is driven by pure scientific rationality, driven to achieve true equality for all the blank slate men, granting to himself the legitimacy of the general will, then he can easily justify just about anything. He can again become a monarch, though this time bounded only by his mind and his ideological drive. No transcendent morality constraining what he can do. Now there is no God, no heaven, and no covenants. Only power as a check to power. Eventually, every structure begins to look like chains, and everyone who had benefited from the old as the tyrant keeping down the innocent. Great cruelty can be excused in this quest, and for all the great leaps of this era, so too were sown the seeds of horrors. Amidst the genius and discovery, there was myopia and naivete, and really that isn't a mark against them. For many of the problems that have now arisen from this way of thinking are problems which are unique to the world of today. They were solving the problems of the world of 300 years ago. They were responding to the world of the 30 Years' War, the printing press, and the age of discovery, in which man sailed across the ocean in wooden ships, while today, we must live in a world of nuclear weapons, of the internet connecting us to unimaginable knowledge, and where airplanes can fly one around the world in mere hours and cheap. Yet in the excitement of this new way of thinking, cracks and follies would begin to become evident quite quickly. For as these thinkers were innovating, developing the sciences, creating great economic productivity, in a great many cases improving quality of life, making more people secure and prosperous, the darker shadow of liberalism was beginning to take form. The late 18th century would be explosive. Here, some of its greatest and its most terrible feats would be on display. There was a great unleashing of liberalism that would emerge into the world. For as the 18th century was entering into its latter decades, and as the 19th would emerge, revolutions, violence, fanaticism, heroism, and cruelty would emerge as a liberalism would arise to become the new religious philosophical substrate of Europe and empires.